I have served the Duke of Ravenscroft for 12 years, and in that time I have seen the man face down a creditor who had armed himself, negotiate the terms of a collapsed mine with 43 furious shareholders in the room, and stand at the graveside of his father without permitting himself a single visible tremor. I have never, in all of it, seen him frightened. He was frightened of his grandmother. Not in the way a man is frightened of a creditor or a mob, not with any outward sign. The Duke of Ravenscroft did not permit outward signs. But I had served him long enough to read the stillness he wore when he was most alarmed, and when the letter arrived from the Dowager Duchess of Ravenscroft in the first week of November, that stillness settled over him like frost on still water, and it did not lift for 3 days. "She is opening Ravenscroft Park," he said, setting the letter down on the corner of the desk with a precision that was, itself, a form of control. "For a winter party." "Very pleasant, Your Grace," I said, which was the only safe thing to say. "She has invited 14 young women." I said nothing. "And their mothers." I arranged the correspondence on my side of the desk with great care. "Finch," said the Duke of Ravenscroft, "I am being hunted." I couldn't say, "Your Grace." He looked at me for a moment with those level gray eyes of his, the eyes that had stopped more than one ambitious man cold in the middle of a lie, and then he said, "We leave for Ravenscroft Park in a fortnight. I intend to arrive, survive the thing with my bachelor status intact, and return to London by the new year." "Certainly, Your Grace." He picked up his pen. "My grandmother is 81 years old. She will not be crossed." "No, Your Grace." "She will also not be indulged." "No, Your Grace." He said nothing more, and I said nothing more, and we both understood perfectly well that the Dowager Duchess of Ravenscroft, who had once, at the age of 78, reduced a cabinet minister to visible weeping at a dinner table over the matter of a misdirected letter, was going to do precisely as she liked. I have always found it useful, in moments of great inevitability, to simply pack a good many warm coats and say very little. We arrived at Ravenscroft Park on the 20th of November, in the kind of cold that makes the north of England feel like the edge of the known world. The house rose out of the gray late afternoon light with its usual imperiousness, all stone and tower and narrow windows, a building that had been designed by someone who believed that comfort was a moral failing. 12 chimneys were already smoking. The drive had been raked. Every lamp in the entrance hall was lit, right down to the smallest bracket sconce at the foot of the east staircase. The Dowager Duchess was waiting in the great hall with the particular stillness of a woman who has been in position for some time and intends to be seen there. She was small and very upright and wore black as she had worn it since the 4th Duke died 40 years ago, not as grief, she had explained once, but as a declaration that she had outlasted him and expected to outlast everyone else as well. Her hair was white, her eyes were the same gray as her grandson's, and her expression, when the Duke walked through the door, was the expression of a woman who has been patient for a very specific reason and can now see the return on her patience beginning to assemble itself. "Callum," she said. "Grandmother," said the Duke, and bent to allow her to take his face in her 2 small hands and examine it as though she were checking a piece of property for storm damage. "You look thin." "I am not thin." "You look as though you have not slept." "I sleep perfectly well." "You look," said the Dowager Duchess, with the serenity of someone delivering a verdict, "like a man who has been alone in London for too long and has forgotten what warmth feels like." The Duke said nothing. He was very good at saying nothing. "Your guests will arrive tomorrow," his grandmother said, releasing his face and turning away with the briskness of someone who has accomplished the opening argument and is now ready to proceed. 14 young ladies and their respective attendants. I have taken some trouble with the invitations. I expect you to be civil." "I am always civil." "You are always cold," said the Dowager Duchess pleasantly, which is not the same thing at all." She walked away, and the Duke watched her go with that still, frost-on-water expression I had learned to recognize. "Finch," he said very quietly. "Your Grace, I want the East Wing made ready. I will take my dinners there." "Very good, Your Grace. Shall I also arrange for the East Wing to have a view of the drive, so that you will see when it becomes possible to leave?" He looked at me. I looked at the middle distance. "Yes," he said after a moment, "that would be useful." I had been a young man when I came to Ravenscroft Park, and I had watched the Duke grow from a boy of 15, all sharp elbows and ferocious pride, into the man he was now, 34 years old, the weight of the estate and the title and 12 years of solitary management sitting on him with the permanence of carved stone. I knew what his grandmother did not know, or perhaps what she knew very well and was choosing to correct, that there had been a young lady once, 6 years ago. An engagement of 4 months, ended without ceremony by the lady in question in favor of a man with a newer title and a sunnier disposition. The Duke had never spoken of it in my hearing, not once in 6 years, but I had seen what it had done to the particular way he held himself in a room where strangers were present. That extra half-inch of reserve, the voice kept carefully level, the way he watched people at the edges of gatherings rather than standing inside them. He had learned that winter 6 years ago, that warmth was a thing that could be taken from you, and he had made the reasonable calculation that the safest course was to stop offering it. I had thought at various times over those 6 years that he was wrong about this, but no one had asked me. The Dowager Duchess had asked no one either. She had simply assembled her list. The 14 young ladies arrived the following morning, in a succession of carriages that came up the drive like a procession, assembled for maximum impressiveness. I stood at the first-floor window of the East Wing and watched them alight. A marquis's daughter with a plume in her hat, 2 sisters from Derbyshire who descended together and were clearly accustomed to being looked at, a red-haired woman with a laugh that carried all the way to the house, a pale, beautiful girl whose mother descended before her, and surveyed the estate with the expression of a person making a purchase, a widow from the south who wore her mourning with studied elegance, a vicar's niece from the west, who had clearly been put into a new gown for the occasion, and was carrying herself with the careful dignity of someone not quite comfortable in it. And then, near the end of the line, a small muddy carriage that had clearly had a difficult journey deposited a single young woman without a maid, without a mother, and without apparent awareness that she was arriving at one of the great houses of northern England. She alighted, set her boots on the gravel, and looked up at the front of the house with the frank, interested expression of someone who had never been taught to pretend anything. She looked at the 12 chimneys. She looked at the stone work above the door. She looked at the espaliered pear trees along the east wall, and then she picked up her own bag, because there was no one to carry it for her, and walked toward the steps with the steady composure of someone who has decided that whatever comes next will be managed. She was not remarkable to look at. She was small and neatly made, with brown hair that had been arranged with some care and was already escaping in one place on the left side, and the kind of face that does not declare itself immediately, that requires a second look, and then a third, and by the third has become the face you look for when you enter a room. She wore a gray wool traveling dress that was clean and well pressed and was clearly her best, and she carried her own bag, and she did all of this with a natural composure that was not the composure of someone who did not notice her situation, but of someone who had decided it did not require comment. I asked Mrs. Dowell, the housekeeper, who she was. Miss Wren Halley, Mrs. Dowell told me, ward of Reverend Halley of Morthwick. She has no family and no fortune and no particular claim to anything, except that the Dowager Duchess specifically requested her name on the list. The Dowager Duchess requested her specifically. 3 times, said Mrs. Dowell, with the expression of someone who has noticed something but is too professional to say what, and assigned her the room that catches the morning light. I looked back out the window. Miss Wren Halley had reached the front steps, and the footman, young Thomas, who was rather green, had offered to take her bag, and she had thanked him with a smile that was so direct and warm that Thomas stood for a moment as though he had been pleasantly startled, the way a person stands when something kind happens unexpectedly. I thought, well, here we are. The first 3 days of the party proceeded according to what I can only describe as a military campaign on the part of the assembled mothers. The great hall, the drawing rooms, the dining table, the gallery, all of them became, in succession, theaters in which 14 young ladies were arranged to their best advantage, and the Duke of Ravenscroft moved through them with the expression of a man walking through a room in which he is not entirely sure of the location of all the furniture. He was, as he had promised, perfectly civil. He was also, as his grandmother had diagnosed, perfectly cold. He asked the correct questions at dinner. He admired the correct things in the gallery. He played whist in the drawing room and lost twice, not because he played badly, but because he was not paying sufficient attention. The other guests tried very hard. I will give them that. The Marquis's daughter was gracious and accomplished, and had been specifically prepared for a northern duke in the way that a thoroughbred is prepared for a particular race. The 2 sisters from Derbyshire were warm and lively, and laughed at the right moments. The pale, beautiful girl played the pianoforte with real skill, and the red-haired woman had a gift for conversation that could have charmed anyone paying attention. They were, to varying degrees, exactly what the situation called for, and the Duke of Ravenscroft looked at all of them with his level gray eyes and was politely elsewhere. His grandmother watched. She said very little, which was more alarming than if she had said a great deal. When the Dowager Duchess of Ravenscroft said nothing, it was because she did not require any of the ordinary instruments. She was working with something finer. Miss Halley did not compete. This was the first thing I noticed about her, and I noticed it because the contrast was so marked. The other young ladies were arranged, positioned, angled. They had been brought to be observed, and they knew it, and some of them were rather good at it. Miss Halley sat in her corner of the drawing room and read. She walked in the garden with whoever happened to be walking, and when no one was, she walked alone and looked at things, the espaliered pear trees, the frozen ornamental pond, the crack in the stone balustrade on the east terrace that I had been meaning to have repaired since September. She asked me about it on the second day. "Mr. Finch," she said, meeting me in the east corridor with a directness that suggested she had been looking for me, "there is a crack in the east terrace balustrade. It runs from the second post to the fourth. I thought you should know, in case someone leans against it." I looked at her. "I was aware of it, Miss Halley. It is on my list." "I thought perhaps it might have been missed," she said, not in the least put out. "The east terrace doesn't get much traffic in winter. I wasn't sure whether anyone was looking at it." "I look at everything," I told her. She considered this. "So do I," she said, and walked away without apparent self-consciousness, and I stood in the east corridor for a moment with the mild sensation of having been assessed and found, if not remarkable, at least acceptable. She was, I realized in those first 3 days, one of those people who see the world at a slightly different angle from everyone else, not slant, not cynically, but with a simple noticing quality that most people lose somewhere between childhood and society. She noticed the cracked hinge on the east wing side door and mentioned it to a footman. She noticed that the tabby cat, who lived in the kitchen and was in theory not allowed above stairs, had taken up residence under a chair in the blue morning room, and rather than remove it, she simply made sure no one sat on that particular chair by accident. She noticed that Lord Ashby, who had arrived on the 3rd day, a well-titled gentleman of 40 with very fine manners and very little else, had a habit of steering women who interested him to the corners of rooms where there were fewer witnesses. I noticed that she noticed this last thing, and I thought, she is cleverer than anyone in this house is crediting. There was a moment on the afternoon of the 3rd day that I heard about afterward from Mrs. Dowell, who had it from Thomas, who had been passing in the corridor with a coal scuttle. The Dowager Duchess had drawn Miss Hallie aside in the drawing room, simply turned from a conversation with the Marquis's daughter as though she had remembered something, and taken Miss Hallie's arm, and walked with her to the far end of the room where the window overlooked the frozen garden. "I understand," the Dowager Duchess had said, "that you noticed the East Terrace balustrade." "It needs repair," Miss Hallie had said. "It does. Finch has been meaning to attend to it. He told me it is on his list. He is a thorough man." A pause. "Do you notice a great many things, Miss Hallie?" "I find I cannot help it." The Dowager Duchess had looked at her, a long, considering look, the kind she used for inspecting things she was considering acquiring or endorsing, and then she had said, "Good," in a tone of tremendous satisfaction, and walked away, and Miss Hallie had been left at the window with the expression of someone who has passed an examination and is not entirely sure what subject it was in. What Miss Hallie did not know, and what I have only been able to reconstruct from several subsequent conversations, was that the Dowager Duchess of Ravenscroft had spent the better part of a year looking for the right person, not the most beautiful, not the best connected, not the most accomplished in the drawing-room arts that the season rewarded. She had been looking for someone who did not perform, because her grandson had been performed at for 15 years, and the performances had only taught him to stay farther away from the stage. She had been looking for someone honest, because honesty was the only thing that could reach him. And she had found, in the ward of a modest Morthwick clergyman, exactly what she needed, and she had put her on the list 3 times to be certain, and she had given her the room with the morning light, and now she was at the window watching the frozen garden with the serene patience of a woman who has set something in motion and intends to let it run. On the 4th day, the Duke of Ravenscroft and Miss Wren Hallie had their first real conversation, and I know how it happened because I was there, though neither of them was attending to me. He had retreated to the library after dinner. This was his habit. The library was the most defensible room in the house, filled with things that gave him excellent reason to be occupied and poor reason to converse, and he went there each evening as other men go to their clubs, to breathe. I was there with some correspondence, and he was there with a book he was not reading, and the house was otherwise full of the particular rumble of a party in its evening mode, music from the drawing-room, voices in the corridor, the far-off sound of Mrs. Dowell managing something. The door opened and Miss Hallie came in, stopped, saw the Duke and did not retreat. "I beg your pardon," she said. "I was looking for the 2nd volume of the Thornbury Botanical Survey. Mrs. Dowell told me it was in here." "The Botanical Survey," said the Duke. "Yes, the 2nd volume. It has the plates of the northern orchids." A pause. "It is on the 3rd shelf from the top," said the Duke, "behind the Italian travel volumes. The spine is faded." She looked at him. He had given her the information with complete matter-of-factness, as though a young woman arriving to claim a botanical survey in the library at 9 in the evening was a perfectly ordinary occurrence, which of course it was not. "Thank you," she said, and went to look, and after a moment she came back with a book and confirmed it with the expression of someone who has correctly identified a thing. "Yes, this is it." She looked at him again. "Do you know your library very well?" "I grew up in it." "That's a fortunate thing." She said it simply, and he looked at her, really looked at her, I thought, perhaps for the first time, and said, "Are you interested in botany, Miss Hallie?" "I'm interested in most things," she said. "Botany in particular because it is patient. The plants don't perform for you. They simply exist, and if you are quiet enough and attentive enough, you learn something true about them." Silence. "As opposed to," said the Duke, "other things that perform." "As opposed," said Miss Hallie with no inflection at all, "to parties." I kept my eyes on my correspondence. I was, in that moment, profoundly grateful to the Dowager Duchess of Ravenscroft. He said, after a moment, The Thornbury survey is reliable on the northern specimens. There is an error in the third volume. He misidentifies the late marsh violet, classifies it under the lowland grouping when it is clearly a northern variant, but the second volume is sound. She looked at him with an expression I had not seen directed at the Duke in some time. Plain interest, unperformed, no angle behind it. "I'll be careful of the third volume," she said. She took her book and went, and the Duke returned to his unread book and sat very still for a moment in a way that was different from his usual stillness. His usual stillness was the stillness of a man holding things at arm's length. This was the stillness of a man who has heard something unexpected and is listening to the echo of it. I kept my eyes on my correspondence and said nothing at all. The following morning at breakfast, the assembled guests were lively in the way that people become lively on the fourth day of a party, when the initial performances have run their course and everyone is settling into something more natural. Miss Hallie arrived a little late, sat at the far end of the table, and ate her toast, and listened to the conversation with the same quality of attentive quiet she brought to everything else. The Marquis's daughter was telling a story about a London ball that drew general laughter. The two sisters from Derbyshire were debating the merits of a particular piece of music they had heard the previous evening. The pale, beautiful girl was silent, as she generally was when her mother was not arranging her. The Duke arrived last, as he generally did, and took his place at the head of the table, and the conversation rearranged itself in the way conversation does when the most significant person in the room enters it. The Marquis's daughter brightened. The two sisters from Derbyshire exchanged a look. Lord Ashby, across the table, smiled with the sociable ease of a man who is comfortable in all rooms and commits to none of them. The Duke ate his breakfast and answered what was asked of him, and asked in return what was required. And I, pouring coffee at the sideboard, observed Miss Hallie observing him with the particular quality of attention she brought to things that interested her, not the pointed attention of a strategist, but the quiet curiosity of someone who finds a thing genuinely worth understanding. When the Duke glanced down the table, a glance that was, I thought, slightly less managed than his others, and their eyes met briefly across the length of it, Miss Hallie did not look away with studied composure. She simply looked at him, as one looks at a thing one is trying to understand, and then looked back at her toast. He looked at his coffee. His grandmother at the other end of the table said nothing and was very pleased. The next morning, his grandmother happened to mention at breakfast that Miss Hallie had been educated by her guardian's housekeeper in languages, and that she read Latin with some facility, and also that she had, on her arrival, correctly identified the variety of the late roses in the East Garden, a North Country heritage variety that the Dowager Duchess had planted 40 years ago, and that most visitors walked past without remark. The Duke listened to all of this with his level gray gaze and said, "She mentioned the northern orchids." "Did she?" said his grandmother, in the tone of someone who is being very carefully unsurprised. "From the Thornbury survey." "Yes, I believe she has found the second volume." "There is an error in the third." "So you told her," said the Dowager Duchess serenely, and reached for her toast. The Duke looked at her. She looked at her toast. Neither of them said anything further, but I, pouring the coffee at the sideboard, thought that the Dowager Duchess of Ravenscroft was, in her 81st year, still the most formidably intelligent person in any room she chose to enter. The misdirected letter happened on the 6th day. The post arrived, as it always did, in a leather satchel that was sorted in my office before distribution. That morning, a letter addressed to Miss W. Hallie was placed, by some reasonable misreading of the handwriting, in the tray for the Duke. I took it to him with the morning correspondence, noted the error, and removed it, but not before the Duke had glanced at the handwriting and said, "That is not for me." "No, Your Grace, Miss Hallie. See that she gets it." "Of course." I delivered it to Miss Hallie in the morning room, where she was sitting at the writing desk with what appeared to be a letter of her own in progress. She thanked me, saw the opened edge. The letter had been broken in transit, not by any human interference, and examined the damage with the pragmatic composure of someone who has learned that things do not always arrive in the condition one might wish. "Has someone read it?" she asked. "No, Miss Hallie. The seal broke in the satchel. It is from Morthwick, I believe, the handwriting on the outside." "From my guardian," she said, and something shifted briefly in her expression, not distress exactly, but the particular look of someone who is keeping themselves very steady over something that requires steadying. "I hope it is good news," I said. "He is not well," she said simply. "He has not been well for some time. The letter will be from Mrs. Cadbury, his housekeeper. She writes to tell me how he is, since he himself does not. He does not wish to trouble me." She looked at the letter a moment longer and then set it aside with a deliberate gentleness. "I will read it this afternoon." I said nothing. There was nothing useful to say. "Mr. Finch," she said, after a moment, with that same directness I was coming to recognize as simply the natural shape of her, "how long have you been here? At Ravenscroft Park, I mean." 12 years, Miss Hallie." "Do you like it?" "Very much." "It is a good house," she said. "I think a house can be a good house even when the people in it are making it complicated." I considered this. "That is exactly right, Miss Hallie." "The bones are good," she said. "You can feel it." She went back to her letter, and I went back to my duties, and I thought, as I walked down the east corridor, yes, the bones are good. The question is whether the man who lives in it has the sense to see what is being put in front of him. The chess game was on the 7th day and happened because the rain made the gardens impossible and the drawing room impossible for different reasons. And the Duke found himself in the small sitting room off the library with a chess board that had been set up by no one in particular. And Miss Hallie came in looking for the 3rd volume of the Thornbury Survey to examine the misidentification he had mentioned, and found the board. "Do you play?" he asked. "Badly," she said. "My guardian taught me, but he plays to think, not to win, so I learned to think but not particularly to defeat anyone." "Sit down," he said. She sat, and they played, and I knew about it because Thomas the footman told me afterward with the particular amazed expression of someone who has witnessed an unusual thing. The Duke had laughed. Not his social laugh, which was brief and courteous and meant very little, but actually laughed at something Miss Hallie had done with her bishop that was technically incorrect, but showed a completely original piece of strategic thinking that he had not predicted. "You cannot do that," he had told her. "I just did," she had said. "It violates the convention." "The convention," she had said, moving the bishop back to consider, "seems to assume that the bishop can only think in one direction. I'm not certain that's a good assumption." He had looked at the board. He had looked at her. And then he had laughed, and Thomas, passing in the corridor with the afternoon coal, had stopped walking, because he had worked at Ravenscroft Park for 3 years and had never once heard the Duke do that. They played for 2 hours. Miss Hallie lost, but it required the Duke's full attention to ensure it. When they emerged from the sitting room, I passed them in the corridor, quite by accident. The Duke was 2 steps ahead, which was his usual distance from everyone, and Miss Hallie was walking at her own pace behind him with the Thornbury 3rd volume under her arm, which she had retrieved from the shelf during a particularly long consideration of a middle game problem. There was a quality to the silence between them that was not the silence of 2 people who have nothing to say to each other, but of 2 people who have said a great deal, and are not yet certain what to do with it. "I will have to look at that misidentification," she said, as they reached the corridor's end. "Page 63, he said without turning. "Thank you." He turned then. It was a small thing, a half-turn, a moment, but I noted it because he did not generally turn back. There is also an error in the plates for the North Fen specimens. Page 91. The draftsman has reversed the petal formation. She looked at him with the full attention of a woman receiving useful information. That would affect the whole identification. It does. I wrote to the publisher some years ago. They have not corrected it. Naturally, she said, with an expression that was not quite exasperation and not quite amusement but something in between, and he looked at that expression with the same arrested quality I was coming to recognize. The quality of a man hearing something he didn't know he'd been waiting for. "Good evening, Miss Hallie," he said. "Good evening, Your Grace." He walked away, and she went in the other direction, and I stood in the corridor of Ravenscroft Park in the cold November evening, and felt the particular quiet certainty of a man watching two complicated things begin to fit together. The following morning the Duke came to my office, which was unusual since I generally came to him, and sat in the chair opposite my desk with his particular economy of movement and said, "Finch, Miss Hallie's guardian, Reverend Hallie of Morthwick, what do you know of him?" I had been expecting something of this nature for 2 days. "A clergyman of the old school, Your Grace, well regarded in the village. His health has declined in recent years. The rheumatism is significant, I understand. Miss Hallie was placed in his care as an infant. Her parents died of a fever. He has provided for her education from his own income, which is modest but sufficient." The Duke listened to all of this. "She received a letter yesterday." "Yes, Your Grace, from his housekeeper." "Is she concerned?" "I believe she is, Your Grace. She receives these letters regularly. She keeps herself very composed about it." He was quiet for a moment. "She is alone here," he said. "Yes, Your Grace. She is the only guest without a family member in attendance." Another silence. "And my grandmother specifically invited her." "3 times, I'm told, Your Grace." He looked at me with those gray eyes, and I looked at the middle distance, and he said, "My grandmother is a very remarkable woman." "Exceptional, Your Grace." He stood, he walked to the door, he stopped. "The East Terrace balustrade," he said. "I have ordered it repaired, Your Grace." Good, a pause. "She noticed it." "She notices most things, Your Grace." He left, and I sat back, and I thought, 12 years of service, and this is the best day of work I have ever done, and I have done nothing except answer questions honestly. What I did not know then, what I learned afterward in pieces, from Thomas and from Mrs. Dowell, and eventually from the Duke himself, was that on the afternoon of the 8th day, when the rain had stopped and a thin winter sun was making the effort, the Duke went for a walk on the grounds without particular direction, and came across Miss Hallie standing at the edge of the frozen ornamental pond, looking at it. He could have turned and walked another way. He did not. "The ice is thick enough to bear weight," she said, without looking at him, which meant she had heard him coming and had chosen to keep her eyes on the pond, which was either very composed of her or very trusting or both. "It is," he said. "Did you skate here as a boy?" A pause, the kind of pause that in another man might have preceded a deflection. "Yes." "With your grandmother?" "My grandmother does not skate." "She seems like someone who would refuse to skate on the grounds that the ice would not dare," said Miss Hallie, and turned to look at him, and he looked at her, and then both of them, unexpectedly, unwarily, were almost smiling. "That is precisely her relationship to ice," he said. She looked back at the pond. "I used to skate with my guardian on the river at Morthwick when I was very small. He tied rope to me so I wouldn't fall." "Did you fall anyway?" "Constantly," she said. "He didn't seem to mind." They stood in silence for a moment, and then she said, "He is not well. Mr. Finch told me you asked." He said nothing immediately. "I'm glad you asked," she said. "Not everyone asks about the things that are real." "What do you mean?" She considered. She had a way of considering things that was entirely without performance, no casting of the eyes, no studied pause. She simply thought, and then she said the thing she had thought. Most conversation in a party like this one is about the surfaces. Who is wearing what? who is eligible, what the weather was like yesterday and what it is likely to be tomorrow. Those are not unimportant conversations. But they are not about anything real, and I have learned that when someone asks about something real, your guardian, a cracked balustrade, a misidentified orchid, they are someone worth knowing. He looked at her for a long moment. My guardian, she said, is the only family I have ever had. The letter from his housekeeper said the rheumatism is in his hands now as well as his back, and that he has not left his chair in a fortnight. He will have written to me by now telling me it is nothing. He will use the exact words perfectly manageable, because he does not want me to worry, and I will write back and say I am certain he is right, because I do not want him to know that I am. She paused. I suppose that is what love is in practice. Two people lying kindly to each other about how frightened they are. He was very still. I'm sorry, she said, with an expression that was not embarrassed but simply honest. I don't usually say quite so much. Please don't apologize, he said, and his voice had dropped a register into something that was not the voice he used at dinner. I asked because I wanted to know. She looked at him with her clear, frank, unhurried gaze, and what she saw in his face I cannot say for certain, though I have my guesses. I think she saw the man under the reserve, the one who had grown up in a library because libraries do not disappoint you, who had learned to hold everything at the length of a formal dinner table because warmth was not always safe. I think she saw it, and I think she did not remark upon it, and that restraint was perhaps the most important thing she did. There are late roses in the East Garden, he said after a moment, a Northern Heritage variety. Most people walk past them. I noticed them, she said. I know, he said. My grandmother told me. She smiled a real smile, the kind that moves the eyes as well as the mouth, and he looked at that smile with an expression that I might have called arrested, had I been there, which I was not. They stood by the frozen pond for some time longer. Thomas, who was trimming the near hedge, told me later that they talked, not the careful, navigated talk of a party but the loose, easy talk of people who have found, improbably, a shared language, and that the Duke did not once assume his formal posture, and that Miss Hallie stood with her hands in her pockets in a way that would have been unremarkable at home, and was here, at a winter party for the purpose of impressing one of the greatest dukes in the North, entirely and perfectly herself. Thomas told me this with the expression of someone delivering good news, and I received it as such. That same evening, the Duke came down for dinner rather than eating in the East Wing, which was the first time in 8 days he had done so. He sat where he always sat at the head of the table and was civil and present in the way he had been at the beginning, but there was a quality to his presence that was different. He was attending rather than enduring. When Miss Hallie at the far end of the table mentioned something about the North Country variety of a rose she had seen in the East Garden, he looked up from his plate, and when Lord Ashby, beside her, said he couldn't say he'd noticed any roses, the Duke said, very quietly, "They're a heritage variety. The planting is 60 years old. Most people don't know what they're looking at." No one in particular was looking at him when he said it except me, and I was looking at the sideboard. The Dowager Duchess smiled at her soup. What I was there for, on the evening of the 9th day, was the incident with Lord Ashby. Lord Ashby was 40 years old and owned a reasonably good estate in the Midlands, and had manners that were, on the surface, impeccable, polished to a high gloss by 40 years of society, and a disposition that understood other people primarily in terms of what they might be useful for. He had been watching Miss Hallie with the particular attention of a man who has decided that she is interesting and unguarded, and that these two qualities together present an opportunity. I had watched him watching her. I had also watched the Duke watching him watching her, with an expression that was, and I mark this because I had never seen quite that expression on the Duke's face before, not his careful, level, managed expression, but a much older expression, something held down from a considerable depth and not, I thought, inclined to be held down much longer. The library, on the 9th evening. Miss Hallie had gone there after dinner, as she had developed the habit of doing, with or without company, and Lord Ashby had followed her, which I observed from the corridor, and I stayed near the door because something in the quality of Lord Ashby's movement told me that I should. I heard his voice through the partially open door, very smooth, very pleased with itself, the voice of a man who has made this kind of approach before and found it generally successful. "You are an interesting young woman, Miss Hallie, remarkably unpretentious for a house party of this kind." "I'm not certain that is a compliment," said Miss Hallie, in her usual matter-of-fact tone. "It is meant as the highest one. You are, shall we say, unencumbered by the usual considerations. No family, no great expectations." A pause. No one to answer to. A silence. Then, "I'm not certain I understand your meaning, Lord Ashby." "I think you understand it very well," he said, and his voice had shifted in the way that told me he was moving closer. "A woman in your position has a great deal of practical wisdom. She knows that the world is arranged in a certain way, and that certain arrangements can be mutually beneficial." "You are proposing," said Miss Hallie, with the steady clarity of someone who intends to be absolutely precise, "that because I have no family and no fortune, I might be persuaded to enter some kind of arrangement that I would refuse if I had either. That is what you mean." "I mean only—" "You mean exactly that," she said, and her voice had not risen at all. It was, if anything, quieter and quieter in the particular way that is not smaller but more concentrated. "I thank you for making it plain. The answer is no." "Miss Hallie." "No." I was already opening the door, but I was not the first one through it. I was the second. The first was the Duke of Ravenscroft. He had come from the direction of the East Corridor, and he entered the library at the particular speed of a man who has been walking very quickly but does not choose to run, and he stopped inside the door and took in the room, Miss Hallie standing at the far end of the bookshelves, Lord Ashby between her and the door, the quality of the air, in approximately 1 second. "Lord Ashby," he said. Lord Ashby turned with the slight overcomposure of a man who knows he has been caught. "Ravenscroft, we were just—" "I heard," said the Duke of Ravenscroft, quite clearly from the corridor. A pause. "I was merely—" "You were," said the Duke with a quiet precision that was in its way more final than shouting, "insulting a guest in my house, a woman who is here under my roof and under my grandmother's particular invitation." He did not look at Lord Ashby again. He looked at Miss Hallie. "Miss Hallie, I am sorry." She was very composed. "There is nothing for you to apologize for, Your Grace." "Nevertheless—" He said it without looking away from her face, and then he looked at Lord Ashby with the expression that I had, in 12 years, only seen him use twice, once with a man who had defrauded his tenants, and once with a man who had struck a horse in his stable, and said, "I will ask you to remove yourself from this room. I will also ask you to remove yourself from Ravenscroft Park in the morning. I will provide a carriage and a letter of reference for any inconvenience. I would, however, be grateful if you did not require me to be more specific about the alternative." Lord Ashby went. And then it was just the two of them, and me in the doorway, and the library's candles and the sound of the fire, and the Duke crossed the room not quickly, but with the directness of a man who has decided to go somewhere and does not intend to change his mind, and stood before her. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "I am sorry I should have left sooner." "I thought he would." "You have nothing to apologize for," he said, and there was something in his voice that I cannot quite transcribe, something that was not the Duke's usual careful register, but the register of a man who has stopped managing himself for a moment, because something more important than management is required. "Your Grace." "Callum," he said. A silence. "I beg your pardon," she said. "My name," he said. "I am telling you my name. Callum. I have been the Duke of Ravenscroft since I was 19 years old, which is 15 years, and in those 15 years I have had very few conversations that were about anything real, and I have spoken to you for 9 days, and I have not had a single conversation that was not." He stopped, as though calculating something. "I would very much like," he stopped again. "Forgive me, I am not accustomed to saying things of this kind." "What kind?" she said, and her voice was very gentle. "The kind that could be refused." Another silence, and then she said, "I notice things, Your Grace. Callum. I notice when a hinge is broken and when a balustrade needs repair, and when a man has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has got so good at carrying it that he has forgotten he doesn't have to." A pause. "I noticed you 9 days ago." "What did you see?" "A man," she said, "who knows every book in his library and goes there every evening to breathe, and who told me about an error in the 3rd volume of a botanical survey without any reason at all, except that he thought I might like to know it. That is what I saw." Silence. "Wren," he said. "Yes." "Will you stay at Ravenscroft Park after the party, as long as you—" He stopped again. "I am asking very badly." "You are asking very honestly," she said, "which I prefer." I walked quietly down the east corridor and left them to it, because some conversations conclude themselves, and the most useful thing a steward can do is ensure that the fire in the library has enough coal to last the evening, which I attended to by way of the service passage without disturbing anyone. The Dowager Duchess of Ravenscroft found me in the great hall at 10 o'clock. "Well," she said, "Lord Ashby will be requiring a carriage in the morning, Your Grace." She examined me with those gray eyes, so exactly like her grandson's. And I believe the library fire has sufficient coal." She looked at me for a long, considering moment, and something in her face settled, not relief exactly, because she had never been in doubt, but the deep satisfaction of a woman who has spent considerable energy on something, and is watching it arrive exactly where she directed it. "Finch," she said at last, "you are an excellent steward." "Thank you, Your Grace." "One of the very best." "You are generous, Your Grace." "I am accurate," she said, and walked away toward the staircase with the upright composure of a woman who has spent 81 years being right about things and expects to spend however many more she is allocated in the same occupation. The party concluded the following week. The 14 young ladies and their mothers departed in the same succession of carriages in which they had arrived, and Ravenscroft Park settled back into its winter quiet, and Miss Wren Halley remained. She remained because the Duke had asked her to, and because she had said yes, and because, as I was to learn in the months that followed, the Dowager Duchess had arranged with the Reverend Halley's housekeeper for the Reverend to winter at Ravenscroft Park, in the warm and well-staffed rooms of the East Wing, where his chair was positioned in the morning light, and his rheumatic hands could rest without the cold that aggravated them, and where his ward was 3 corridors away and could look in on him every morning. I do not know when the Duke made that arrangement. I suspect it was before Lord Ashby's removal from the library, possibly before the chess game, possibly earlier still. The Duke of Ravenscroft, as I have said, is a man who notices what he notices and acts on it without requiring an audience. The weeks between the party's end and the Reverend's arrival were the quietest weeks I had known at Ravenscroft Park, and also, in some way I found difficult to articulate, the warmest. The house was still large and still cold in the way that large northern houses are always cold, but there was a quality to the evenings that had not been there before. The Duke and Miss Halley dined together in the smaller of the 2 dining rooms, which held 2 people comfortably in a way the formal dining room did not. They walked in the afternoons when the weather permitted, and when it did not they sat in the library, he with his correspondence, she with the corrected Thornbury survey, the 3rd volume now annotated in pencil in her neat hand, the errors accumulating at a rate that spoke well of her attention and poorly of the publisher. They talked, and I heard fragments of it as I passed. The estate's history, the names of the tenant families, the flood of 1847 that had taken the old East Wing garden and never entirely restored it, the matter of the North Fen's botanical error, and what ought to be done about publishers who did not respond to perfectly reasonable correspondence. She asked questions the way she noticed things, not as performance, not as a technique of conversation, but because she actually wanted to know. And he answered them, I noticed, with a gradually decreasing number of silences between the question and the answer, as though the distance required before speaking was slowly becoming unnecessary. One evening, I came to the library to tend the fire and found them on opposite sides of the same table, the correspondence and the botanical survey sharing the surface in the companionable way of two separate tasks conducted by people who have quietly stopped needing to perform for each other. Neither of them looked up when I entered. The Duke was writing. Miss Hallie was reading and had tucked her feet up on the chair in a way that would have surprised anyone who had only seen her at the dining table. The fire was already adequate. I left it alone and went out again, and I thought, there it is. That is what it looks like. On the morning the East Terrace repair was completed, the balustrade rebuilt, the new stone cut to match the old. Miss Hallie walked out to look at it, and the Duke, who had been in the West study and could not have known she was there, came out some minutes later and stood beside her. They examined the stonework together in silence. Then she said something I did not quite catch, and he said something back, and she laughed a real laugh, quiet and quick, and he put his hand briefly on her shoulder, and then they walked back in together through the East Wing door, and the East Wing door, I noted, did not squeak, because the hinge had also been repaired. What I do know is that on the morning the Reverend Hallie arrived, pale and thin, and entirely overwhelmed by the scale and warmth of the arrangements made on his behalf. Miss Hallie met him in the great hall, and the look on her face when she took his cold hands in hers, and felt that they had found somewhere warm, was not the face of a woman who is performing gratitude. It was the face of a woman whose heart had been eased of a weight she had been carrying for longer than anyone had asked. The Duke was not in the great hall. He was at the top of the stairs, and I was behind him, and he stood very still and watched her greet her guardian, and the expression on his face was the expression of a man who has given something, not a gift exactly, but a door open to warmth, and has found in the giving of it the first uncomplicated satisfaction he has known in a very long time. I said nothing. He said nothing. After a moment he went back down the corridor toward the library. We were married in the spring. They were, I should say, though the staff of Ravenscroft Park had taken a proprietary interest in the outcome that made the first-person plural feel accurate. The ceremony was held in the private chapel on the estate, which the Dowager Duchess had insisted upon, on the grounds that she was 81 years old, and did not intend to travel to a church in April for anyone, including her grandson, which was so magnificently characteristic of her that no one argued. The Reverend Hallie, much restored by the winter at Ravenscroft Park, performed the ceremony. His hands were still stiff, but he held the book steadily, and his voice when he read the words was clear and warm, and when he blessed them both he did it with the particular quality of a man who has prayed for something specific for some years, and is now watching it come to pass. Miss Wren Hallie, the Duchess of Ravenscroft, as she became in the moment the Duke placed the ring on her finger, did not weep at her wedding. I had not expected her to. She was not a woman who did the expected thing. She stood very straight and said the words with the same clear-eyed directness with which she said everything, and when the Duke said his words, he said them quietly and without ornament, and entirely as if he meant every syllable of them, which he did. The Dowager Duchess sat in the front pew and did not weep either, on the grounds that she had known this was going to happen from the moment she had seen Miss Hallie's name on the list she herself had requested from Mrs. Dowell 3 times, and that one does not weep over the successful execution of a plan. I stood at the back and felt the particular quiet warmth of a man who has served somewhere long enough to have watched a house come properly to life. What the Duke told me, some weeks later, with the directness that was his own version of the same quality he admired in his wife. He told me that the thing that had undone him was not the chess game, or the botanic survey, or even the evening in the library. It was what she had said at the frozen pond. Two people lying kindly to each other about how frightened they are, he said. That is what love is in practice. He was quiet for a moment. I had never heard it said plainly before. No, Your Grace. She says everything plainly. She does, Your Grace. It is, he said, with the considering quality of a man who is identifying something precisely, the most extraordinary thing I have ever encountered. I thought about the 15 years of careful management, the frost-on-water stillness, the library retreats, the level gray eyes holding everyone at the length of a dinner table. I thought about the evening in the library and the fire I had quietly tended. I thought about the Dowager Duchess with her toast and her perfectly unsurprised expression. She notices things, Your Grace, I said. Yes, he said, she noticed me. He said it with the simplicity of a man who has spent a long time not being noticed, not truly noticed, not in the way that sees the man under the title and the reserve and the careful management, and has found in being noticed at last not exposure but the opposite of it, the relief of being known by someone who looked without flinching and stayed anyway. I folded my papers. I said, I believe, Your Grace, that your grandmother will be very pleased. My grandmother, said the Duke of Ravenscroft, with something in his voice that was not quite a smile but was the near neighbor of one, has been pleased with herself since November. She has every reason, Your Grace. Don't tell her I said so. I would not dream of it, Your Grace. He picked up his pen, and I picked up my correspondence, and the morning light came through the library windows onto the good bones of the house, and somewhere in the east wing the Reverend Halley was reading in his chair in the sun, and somewhere in the garden the Duchess of Ravenscroft was, I had no doubt, noticing things, a cracked hinge, a north country rose, the quality of a frost, and finding them interesting, and storing them away against the time they might be useful. I have served the Duke of Ravenscroft for 12 years, and I expect to serve him for 12 more. It is, as I said, a good house. It is a house that knows itself now, in a way that houses do when they are properly inhabited, when the people in them are not managing each other from careful distances, but simply living together in the light. The east terrace balustrade holds. The east wing hinge is quiet. The tabby cat has been officially permitted above stairs, which Mrs. Dowell pretends to object to and does not enforce. The bones were always good. We simply needed someone to come along and say so plainly.